Hello everyone, I am the Seleni, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first body appeared on a Tuesday morning in Kings Park, suspended 20 feet above the ground between two ancient jara trees. Limbs splayed in a configuration that defied both gravity and human anatomy. Detective Inspector Sarah Mackenzie had seen her share of gruesome crime scenes during 15 years with the Western Australia Police Force, but nothing had prepared her for the sight that greeted her as she ducked under the yellow tape at dawn on that particular October morning. The victim, a 34-year-old accountant named Michael Chen, hung in the pale pre-dawn light like some grotesque piece of performance art. His body contorted into angles that suggested his bones had been liquefied and then reset according to some alien geometry. Sarah stood beneath the suspended corpse, her breath creating small clouds in the crisp autumn air, trying to process what she was seeing. Perth's isolation from the rest of Australia had always been both blessing and curse. Blessed with pristine beaches, endless blue skies, and a relaxed lifestyle that made it feel like the world's most beautiful secret, but cursed with a sense of being cut off from everything, surrounded by thousands of kilometers of red earth and scrubland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. This morning, that isolation felt more pronounced than ever, as if whatever had done this to Michael Chen had emerged from that vast emptiness specifically to claim Perth as its hunting ground. "What do you make of it, Sarah?" asked Detective Constable James Liu, his usually steady voice betraying a tremor as he approached from the car park. James had been her partner for 3 years, ever since transferring from the Perth CBD station, and she had never seen him look quite so pale. His dark hair was disheveled, and his typically immaculate uniform looked like he'd slept in it, though she knew he'd probably been up all night with his newborn daughter. The call had come through at 4:30 in the morning. A jogger had spotted something unusual in the trees and called emergency services, thinking it might be some kind of art installation gone wrong. "I don't know what to make of it," Sarah admitted, pulling out her notebook and beginning to sketch the scene. Her hand moved across the page in quick, precise strokes, capturing the impossible angles of the suspended body, the way the morning light filtered through the canopy above, the small crowd of uniformed officers who had cordoned off the area. Have you ever seen anything like this before? I mean, anywhere? In training, in textbooks, in your worst nightmares? She looked up at James, studying his face carefully. They had developed an easy rapport over their years working together, built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to bringing closure to Perth's victims and their families. But this case felt different already, and she could see in his expression that he felt it too. James shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on the body above them. "Nothing even close. I mean, the positioning alone. Look at his arms, Sarah. Look at his legs. It's like someone took him apart and put him back together wrong. And how did they get him up there? There's no ladder, no climbing equipment, no obvious way to reach that height. The trees are smooth-barked, no footholds, and the lowest branches are at least 30 feet up." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "And then there's the fact that there's no blood. Not a drop. Not on the body. Not on the ground. Not on the trees. If someone did this to him here, where's all the blood? And if they did it somewhere else, how did they transport him here without leaving any evidence?" The crime scene photographer, a thin man named Derek, whom Sarah had worked with dozens of times over the years, finished taking his initial shots and approached them with his equipment bag slung over his shoulder. "I've never photographed anything like this," he said, echoing their thoughts. "The lighting keeps playing tricks on me. Every time I look through the viewfinder, it seems like the body is in a slightly different position, even though I know that's impossible. And my camera keeps malfunctioning. The digital display shows error messages I've never seen before, and half my shots are coming out with strange artifacts, like interference patterns or double exposures, even though I'm using a professional-grade digital SLR that's been serviced recently." Sarah made additional notes, documenting Derek's technical difficulties. In her experience, equipment failures at crime scenes were usually just coincidental. Stress could make people imagine problems that weren't really there, and complex electronics could be temperamental under the best of circumstances. But something about Derek's description nagged at her. She had worked with him on hundreds of cases, and he was methodical, professional, not given to flights of fancy or technical excuses. If he said his equipment was malfunctioning in unusual ways, she was inclined to believe him. The coroner's van arrived just as the sun was beginning to rise properly over the Perth Hills, casting long shadows across Kings Park's carefully maintained lawns and garden beds. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the forensic pathologist who had worked most of Perth's high-profile cases over the past decade, emerged from the passenger seat, carrying her medical bag, and wearing an expression of professional curiosity, mixed with barely concealed unease. Sarah had known Liz for years. They had met during a case involving a series of domestic violence murders in Fremantle, and she could read the older woman's moods with considerable accuracy. This morning, Liz looked like someone who had been told she was about to encounter something that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her profession. "Sarah, James." Liz nodded to them as she approached, her graying hair pulled back in its characteristic practical bun, her medical whites already protected by a forensic coverall. "I got the preliminary report from dispatch, but I have to say, the description didn't really prepare me for..." She looked up at Michael Chen's suspended form and fell silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "How long has he been up there? Do we have any witness statements? Any idea about time of death?" "The jogger who found him says he runs this route every morning at 5:30, and the body wasn't there yesterday," James reported, consulting his notes. "Park maintenance crews finished their rounds at 6 p.m. yesterday evening, and their supervisor confirms there was nothing unusual in this section at that time. So we're looking at a window of roughly 11 and a half hours, from 6 p.m. yesterday to 5:30 this morning. But Liz..." He paused, clearly struggling with how to articulate what he was thinking. "Look at the state of the body. Look at the positioning. This isn't something that could have been done quickly, and it's not something that could have been done quietly. Kings Park gets a lot of foot traffic, even at night. Joggers, dog walkers, teenagers looking for privacy. How does someone suspend a body 20 feet in the air without anyone noticing?" Liz was already unpacking her equipment, laying out instruments on a portable table that her assistant had set up beneath the trees. "I'm going to need to examine the body in situ before we attempt to bring it down," she said, pulling on latex gloves with practiced efficiency. "The positioning suggests either post-mortem manipulation, which would require considerable time and specialized equipment, or..." She trailed off, clearly reluctant to voice whatever alternative explanation she was considering. "Or what?" Sarah prompted, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Or the positioning occurred while the subject was still alive," Liz finished quietly. "Which would mean we're looking at a level of torture and physical manipulation that goes well beyond anything I've encountered in 25 years of forensic pathology. The human skeletal system simply isn't designed to bend and flex in the ways this body has been arranged. If Michael Chen was alive when this was done to him, the pain would have been She shook her head, apparently unable to find words for what she was imagining. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She had always prided herself on her ability to remain objective and professional in the face of even the most disturbing crime scenes. But something about this case was affecting her more deeply than usual. Perhaps it was the impossible nature of what they were seeing. Or perhaps it was the growing sense that Michael Chen's death was not an isolated incident, but the beginning of something much larger and more terrible. Perth's isolation, which had always felt like a protective barrier against the worst excesses of the outside world, now felt like a trap. As if whatever had done this to Michael Chen had specifically chosen Perth because of its remoteness, its separation from help, its vulnerability. The fire department's ladder truck arrived shortly after 9 a.m., its diesel engine rumbling through the morning quiet as it maneuvered into position beneath the suspended body. Fire Captain Tom Morrison, a stocky man in his 50s whom Sarah had worked with on numerous occasions, directed his crew with the same calm professionalism he brought to building fires and traffic accidents. But she could see the tension in his movements, the way his eyes kept darting up to Michael Chen's impossible form. Tom had been fighting fires in Western Australia for more than 30 years, had pulled bodies from burning buildings and automobile wrecks, had seen human beings at their most vulnerable and damaged. But this was clearly something outside his experience as well. We're going to need to be extremely careful bringing him down, Tom explained to the assembled team as his crew extended the ladder and positioned safety equipment. The way the body is suspended, it doesn't make sense from an engineering perspective. There's no obvious support system, no rigging that we can identify. It's almost like he's being held in place by... He paused, clearly struggling to find scientific language for what he was observing. Well, like he's being held in place by nothing at all, which is impossible, obviously, but that's what it looks like from down here. Sarah watched as one of Tom's crew members, a young firefighter named Kevin, climbed the ladder toward the suspended body. Kevin moved with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to working at height. But as he approached Michael Chen's form, his movements became increasingly hesitant, increasingly careful. When he reached the level of the body, he stopped, completely, hanging onto the ladder and staring at what he found there. "Captain Morrison," Kevin called down, his voice tight with something that might have been fear or might have been revulsion. "You need to see this. I mean, everyone needs to see this. There's no support system up here at all. No ropes, no cables, no framework. The body is just floating, hanging in empty air. And Captain, there's something else. The body, it's warm. Not room temperature, not cool like you'd expect from someone who's been dead for hours. Warm, like he's still alive." The silence that followed Kevin's report stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Sarah found herself looking around at the faces of her colleagues, James, Liz, Tom, Derek, the various uniformed officers and emergency personnel who had gathered at the scene, and seeing her own confusion and growing unease reflected in their expressions. This was supposed to be a crime scene, a puzzle to be solved through careful application of forensic science and police procedure. But nothing about Michael Chen's death fit into any category of crime they were equipped to handle. "Kevin, I want you to check for a pulse," Tom called up to his crew member. "And I want you to be extremely careful. Don't touch the body any more than absolutely necessary. And if anything feels wrong, anything at all, I want you to come down immediately." Sarah watched Kevin reach out tentatively toward Michael Chen's neck, stretching from his position on the ladder to make contact with the suspended figure. The moment his gloved fingers touched the victim's throat, several things happened simultaneously. Kevin jerked backwards so violently that he nearly lost his grip on the ladder. The crime scene photographer's equipment began making a high-pitched whining sound, and Michael Chen's eyes opened. The collective intake of breath from the assembled team was audible even over the ambient sounds of morning traffic and birdsong. Michael Chen's eyes, dark brown, completely normal-looking except for the fact that they belonged to someone who had been pronounced dead hours earlier, moved slowly across the faces of the people gathered beneath him. His expression was not one of pain or confusion or fear, as might be expected from someone in his situation. Instead, he looked almost peaceful, as if he were waking from a pleasant dream and taking a moment to orient himself to his surroundings. "Detective Mackenzie," Michael Chen said, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air, despite the fact that he was 20 feet above them and suspended in a position that should have made speech difficult if not impossible. "You need to understand that this is just the beginning. Perth has been chosen for very specific reasons, and my death, my transformation, is only the first step in a process that has been planned for a very long time. The isolation that has always protected this city is now working against it. Help is too far away, and what is coming cannot be stopped by conventional means." Sarah felt her training kick in, even as her mind struggled to process what she was hearing. She pulled out her voice recorder and activated it, then called up to the figure suspended above them. "Michael, can you tell us who did this to you? Can you tell us how you came to be in this position?" Her voice was steady, professional, giving no indication of the chaos of thoughts and emotions churning beneath the surface. Michael Chen's impossible smile widened slightly. "I did this to myself, detective, or rather, I allowed it to be done to me, because I understood what was being offered. The entity that has chosen Perth needs agents, anchors, focal points for its power. Those of us who accept the transformation willingly experience no pain, only a kind of transcendence. We become part of something larger than ourselves, something that has existed far longer than human civilization, and will continue to exist long after your species has been forgotten." "What entity?" Sarah pressed, though she was no longer sure. She wanted to hear the answer. "What are you talking about? What's happening in Perth?" The suspended figure was quiet for a long moment, his gaze turning away from the assembled crowd toward the city skyline visible through the trees. Perth's central business district rose in the distance, a cluster of modern glass and steel towers that caught and reflected the morning sunlight. Beyond the city, the Swan River curved through the landscape like a silver ribbon, and beyond that, the suburbs stretched toward the horizon, nearly 1 million people going about their daily lives, with no idea that their world was about to change in ways they could not imagine. "It has many names, but no name that your language can properly express," Michael Chen said finally. "It is ancient, beyond human understanding, and it feeds on isolation, on separation, on the spaces between things. Perth is perfect for its purposes. Cut off from the rest of Australia by thousands of kilometers of empty land, surrounded by ocean, psychologically isolated despite its population and modern amenities. The entity has been waiting for the right moment, when the conditions would be optimal for its emergence into physical reality. That moment is now." James had been taking notes frantically throughout this exchange, but now he looked up from his notebook with an expression of professional skepticism mixed with personal fear. "Michael, you're describing some kind of supernatural phenomenon, but what we're dealing with here has to have a rational explanation. Someone killed you, or tried to kill you, and somehow suspended your body in this tree. There has to be evidence, has to be a way to trace whoever did this. Can you give us any details about the people involved? Any physical descriptions? Any information about their methods or motives?" The figure above them made a sound that might have been laughter, though it was unlike any human laughter Sarah had ever heard. It seemed to come from somewhere other than Michael Chen's throat, as if the air itself were producing the sound. Detective Liu, you're thinking about this in entirely the wrong way. There are no people involved in the sense that you mean. There is only the entity, and those of us who have chosen to serve it. The methods are not technological or mechanical. They are expressions of will, manifestations of power that operates according to laws your science does not recognize. Dr. Harper had been listening to this exchange while continuing to examine the scene from ground level, using binoculars to study Michael Chen's suspended form in detail. Now she approached Sarah and spoke in a low voice that was barely audible to the others present. Sarah, I need to share some observations with you privately. What I'm seeing here contradicts everything I know about human anatomy and physics, and I'm concerned that we may be dealing with something that goes beyond the scope of a conventional police investigation. Sarah nodded and followed Liz to a position several meters away from the main group, though she kept the suspended figure in her peripheral vision. Even this brief separation from the immediate scene brought some relief. Being directly beneath Michael Chen's impossible form had created a sense of pressure, of being watched and evaluated by something that was only wearing Michael Chen's appearance like a mask. What are you thinking? Sarah asked, once they were out of earshot of the others. Liz glanced back toward the suspended figure, then spoke carefully, choosing her words with obvious precision. Sarah, I've been a forensic pathologist for 25 years. I've examined bodies that have been subjected to every conceivable type of violence, accident, and natural death. I understand human anatomy, physics, chemistry, biology. What I'm observing here violates fundamental principles in all of those areas. The positioning of the body requires forces and leverage that don't exist in our physical environment. The preservation of life signs despite obvious massive trauma is medically impossible. And the fact that the subject is conscious, coherent, and communicating normally while suspended in a position that should compromise blood flow to the brain. She shook her head. I don't have scientific language for what we're dealing with. So what are you recommending? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew what Liz was going to say. I think we need to contact Perth headquarters and request specialized support, Liz replied. I don't know what kind of specialized support because I don't know what category of problem this is, but it's beyond the scope of a routine homicide investigation, and it's beyond the scope of standard forensic pathology. We need people with expertise in whatever this is. Sarah was about to respond when she became aware of a change in the quality of sound around them. The ambient noise of morning traffic, which had provided a constant background hum throughout their investigation, was fading. The bird song that had been audible from the trees throughout Kings Park was diminishing. Even the sound of voices from her colleagues, who were continuing their examination of the scene just a few meters away, seemed to be becoming more distant and muffled. Liz, Sarah said quietly, do you notice anything different about the acoustics here? The older woman paused, tilting her head slightly as if listening for something specific. Yes, she said after a moment. It's like we're in some kind of sound dampening field, or like the normal sounds of the city are being absorbed or redirected, somehow. She looked around them with growing concern. Sarah, I think we should rejoin the others. I don't think it's safe for us to be separated from the main group right now. They walked quickly back toward the cluster of police and emergency personnel gathered beneath Michael Chen's suspended form. But as they approached, Sarah realized that something had changed during their brief absence. The people were there. James, Tom Morrison, Derek, Kevin still on the ladder, the various uniformed officers. But they were motionless, frozen in position like figures in a photograph. James stood with his notebook in one hand and pen in the other. His face turned upward toward the suspended figure, but his expression was blank, vacant, as if he were sleepwalking with his eyes open. "James?" Sarah called, but her partner didn't respond. She reached out and touched his shoulder, and his skin felt cold through the fabric of his uniform shirt, cold in a way that suggested something more than just the morning air temperature. "James, can you hear me?" "They cannot hear you, Detective Mackenzie." Michael Chen's voice came from above them, though when Sarah looked up, she saw that his lips weren't moving. The voice seemed to come from the air around them, from the trees themselves, from some source that was everywhere and nowhere at once. Time moves differently here now. They are experiencing a single moment stretched across hours, while you and Dr. Harper exist in accelerated time, moving through minutes in what feels like seconds to them. Sarah felt her heart rate increase, her breathing become shallow and rapid. The professional training that had sustained her through 15 years of police work was struggling to provide a framework for understanding what she was experiencing. "What do you want?" she asked, directing her question toward the suspended figure, though she was no longer certain that Michael Chen was the source of the communication. "I want you to understand," the voice replied. And now it seemed to be coming from directly beside her, as if someone were standing at her shoulder and speaking softly into her ear. Perth has been chosen because of its isolation, its separation from the centers of power and communication that might interfere with the process of transformation. What you are witnessing is the beginning of a fundamental change in the nature of reality within this geographic area. The entity I serve has been waiting for the optimal moment to establish a foothold in your physical dimension, and that moment has arrived. Dr. Harper had moved closer to Sarah during this exchange, and now she spoke in a whisper that barely disturbed the unnatural quiet that had settled over the crime scene. "Sarah, we need to leave this area immediately. I don't understand what's happening here, but I know it's dangerous, and I know it's spreading. Look at the trees around us. Do you see what's happening to the leaves?" Sarah followed Liz's gaze upward and saw that the eucalyptus trees surrounding them were undergoing some kind of transformation. The leaves, which had been their normal green color when the investigation began, were now taking on a silvery metallic appearance, as if they were being replaced by thin sheets of reflective material. As she watched, the transformation spread from leaf to leaf, branch to branch, with a slow but inexorable progression that reminded her of infection or disease. The physical environment is adapting to accommodate the entity's presence, the voice continued, now seeming to come from the transformed leaves themselves. What you perceive as trees and grass and soil are simply matter arranged in patterns that reflect the assumptions and expectations of human consciousness. As the entity's influence grows stronger, matter will be rearranged according to different patterns, different assumptions about the nature of reality. Sarah grabbed Liz's arm and began moving toward the car park, though she found that walking required tremendous effort, as if the air around them had become thick and viscous. Each step felt like pushing through invisible resistance, and the distance to their vehicles seemed to be increasing even as they moved toward them. "How do we stop this?" she called over her shoulder, addressing her question to whatever intelligence was speaking through Michael Chen's suspended form. "You cannot stop it," came the reply. And now the voice was definitely following them, staying close as they struggled toward the parking area. "But you can choose how you experience it. Those who resist the transformation will experience it as death, dissolution, the destruction of everything they understand about themselves and their world. Those who accept it willingly will experience it as transcendence, as an expansion of consciousness, and capability beyond anything your species has previously achieved. They reached Sarah's police vehicle, a white Ford sedan with the WA police insignia on the doors, and she fumbled with her keys while looking back toward the crime scene they had just fled. The cluster of motionless figures was still visible through the trees, but they seemed smaller now, more distant, as if the geography of Kings Park were stretching and distorting to accommodate forces that operated according to non-Euclidean principles. "Liz, get in the car," Sarah said, though her voice sounded strange in her own ears, distorted by whatever acoustic phenomenon was affecting the area. "We need to get back to headquarters and report this to the superintendent. We need to evacuate the park, maybe evacuate the surrounding neighborhoods. We need to contact the federal authorities, maybe the military. I don't know what we're dealing with, but it's too big for the local police to handle." Dr. Harper climbed into the passenger seat, but as Sarah turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The dashboard lights didn't illuminate. The engine didn't turn over. There was no sound at all from the vehicle's electrical or mechanical systems. She tried again, pumping the accelerator and turning the key more forcefully, but the car remained completely unresponsive. "The entity's influence extends to all forms of technology within the affected area," the voice explained, and Sarah realized that Michael Chen was now visible in her rearview mirror, though when she turned to look directly behind the car, there was nothing there. Internal combustion engines, electrical systems, radio communications, cellular networks, all are subject to disruption, as the local laws of physics are modified to accommodate a different kind of existence. Sarah pulled out her mobile phone and saw that it showed no signal, no network connection, and when she tried to turn it on, the screen remained black despite the fact that she had charged it fully the night before. "We're going to have to walk," she told Liz, opening the car door and stepping back out into the increasingly strange morning air. Perth CBD is about 3 kilometers from here. If we can reach headquarters, we can use landline communications to contact the federal authorities. But as they began walking toward the park's main entrance, Sarah realized that the transformation affecting Kings Park was not confined to the immediate area around Michael Chen's suspended form. The trees lining the walking paths were showing the same silvery leaf transformation they had observed at the crime scene. The grass beneath their feet felt spongy and unstable, as if the soil were becoming less solid, more fluid. And the sky above them, which had been clear blue when the investigation began, was now taking on a strange, opalescent quality, shot through with colors that didn't quite correspond to anything in Sarah's experience of normal atmospheric phenomena. "Dr. Harper," she said as they walked, "in your professional opinion, what are we dealing with here? I know you said it goes beyond conventional forensic pathology, but you must have some theory, some framework for understanding what we've observed." Liz was quiet for several minutes, clearly struggling to organize her thoughts. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful, measured, as if she were presenting a scientific paper to a skeptical audience. "Sarah, everything I've observed this morning contradicts fundamental principles of biology, physics, and chemistry. If I were to write a report based on what we've seen, it would read like science fiction or fantasy rather than forensic documentation. A human being suspended in midair without mechanical support. Consciousness and communication maintained despite what should be fatal trauma. Matter transforming its basic properties in response to some unknown force. Technology failing in ways that suggest interference with electromagnetic and chemical processes at a molecular level." They had reached the main entrance to Kings Park, but the scene that greeted them was far from normal. The car park, which had been busy with early morning joggers and dog walkers when they arrived, now contained dozens of vehicles, but no people. Cars sat with their doors open, engines running, music playing from their stereos, but their occupants had simply vanished. Sarah approached one of the abandoned vehicles, a red Toyota Camry with a coffee cup still steaming on the dashboard, and a morning radio show playing from the speakers, and looked inside, hoping to find some clue about what had happened to the driver. The transformation process affects different individuals at different rates, the voice that had been following them explained, though now it seemed to be emanating from the abandoned car's radio speakers. Those with strong attachment to physical reality resist longer and experience the transition as trauma. Those who are more flexible in their understanding of the nature of existence adapt more quickly and with less distress. Sarah turned away from the abandoned Toyota and continued toward the street that would take them back toward Perth's city center, but she found herself moving more slowly, not because of the physical resistance they had experienced earlier, but because of a growing sense that leaving Kings Park might not be possible. The transformation that had begun around Michael Chen's suspended form was spreading outward in all directions, and they might already be too deeply within its influence to escape. "Sarah," Liz said quietly, "look at the city skyline." Sarah raised, her eyes toward Perth's CBD, visible in the distance beyond the Swan River, and saw that the familiar cluster of office towers and apartment buildings was changing. The glass and steel structures were taking on the same silvery reflective quality they had observed in the transformed trees, but more than that, they seemed to be shifting in their fundamental geometry. Buildings that had been rectangular were becoming curved, twisted, folded in on themselves in ways that defied architectural logic. The spacing between structures was increasing and decreasing in random patterns, as if the urban landscape were breathing or pulsing with some internal rhythm. The entity's influence is not confined to Kings Park, Sarah realized aloud. It's affecting the entire city. Liz, we need to find other survivors, people who haven't been affected by whatever's happening. We need to organize some kind of resistance or evacuation or... She trailed off, realizing that she had no idea what kind of response would be appropriate for a situation that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of normal reality. They reached the intersection of Kings Park Road and Thomas Street, one of the main arteries connecting the park to Perth's central business district, and found themselves in the middle of what should have been busy morning traffic, but was instead a surreal tableau of abandoned vehicles and inexplicable phenomena. Cars, trucks, buses, and motorcycles sat motionless in the street, many with their engines still running, but their occupants were nowhere to be seen. Traffic lights continued to cycle through their normal sequence of red, yellow, and green, but the colors seemed wrong somehow, shifted toward spectrums that human eyes weren't designed to process. "Detective Mackenzie," a familiar voice called from behind them, and Sarah turned to see James Liu walking toward them from the direction of Kings Park. But something was wrong with her partner's appearance. His movements were too fluid, too coordinated, and his eyes reflected light in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of the transformed leaves they had observed on the trees. "James," Sarah said carefully, "where have you been? What happened to the rest of the team at the crime scene?" James smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. And when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate from somewhere other than his throat. "Sarah, I've been waiting for you to understand what's happening here. The rest of the team has already made the transition. They've accepted the entity's gift and become part of something larger than their individual existence. You and Dr. Harper are among the last to resist the transformation, but your resistance is causing you unnecessary pain and confusion." Sarah instinctively reached for her service weapon, though she wasn't sure what good it would do against whatever James had become. "James, I need you to tell me exactly what's happened to you. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Are you being coerced or controlled by someone? The figure wearing James Liu's appearance laughed, and the sound echoed strangely off the abandoned vehicles surrounding them. Sarah, you're still thinking about this in terms of human categories: injury, coercion, control. Those concepts don't apply to what I've become. I've been offered an expansion of consciousness, an enhancement of capability, a connection to intelligence and power that spans dimensions. The individual personality you knew as James Liu still exists, but is part of a larger collective consciousness. That includes Michael Chen, the other members of our investigation team, and thousands of other Perth residents who have chosen to accept the gift. Dr. Harper had been listening to this exchange while examining the abandoned vehicles around them, but now she approached Sarah and spoke in an urgent whisper. Sarah, I don't think this is really James. Look at his shadow. Do you see how it doesn't quite match his body position? And his reflection in the car windows. It's subtly different from his actual appearance. I think we're dealing with some kind of projection or simulation, something that's wearing James's form, but isn't actually him. The James figure's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too white, too perfectly aligned, too numerous for a normal human mouth. Dr. Harper is very observant, it said, but her analysis is incomplete. I am James Liu, but I am also much more than James Liu ever was while confined to a single physical form and individual consciousness. The entity's gift doesn't destroy identity. It expands identity beyond the limitations of flesh and individual experience. Sarah found herself backing away from the figure, pulling Liz with her toward one of the abandoned vehicles. If you're really James, then tell me something only James would know. Tell me about your daughter, about why you transferred from CBD station, about the case we worked last month involving the domestic violence incident in Fremantle. The James figure paused, its expression becoming thoughtful, almost melancholy. Lily was born 6 weeks ago, it said, and now its voice carried emotional tones that were unmistakably James Liu's. 3 kilograms, 200 grams. Born at King Edward Memorial Hospital at 2:30 in the morning on September 15th. I transferred from CBD station because I wanted to work with you specifically. Your reputation for solving difficult cases, your commitment to victims and their families. The Fremantle case involved Marcus Sullivan, who had been stalking and threatening his ex-wife Rebecca for 3 months before she was finally willing to press charges. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. The details were accurate, intimate, impossible for anyone other than James to know. But the figure speaking them was clearly not entirely human, not entirely the partner she had worked with for 3 years. James, if you're really in there, if some part of you is still James Liu, then help us understand what's happening and how to stop it. Sarah, the figure replied, I am helping you. I'm trying to explain that resistance is pointless and painful. The entity's transformation of Perth is inevitable. It has been planned for decades, prepared for through careful observation and analysis of this city's unique characteristics. The isolation, the distance from other population centers, the psychological separation that Perth residents feel from the rest of Australia. All of these factors make Perth ideal for the entity's purposes. What purposes? Sarah demanded. What does this entity want with Perth? What does it want with humanity? The James figure gestured toward the transformed cityscape visible in the distance, where Perth's familiar skyline continued to shift and change in impossible ways. The entity exists in dimensions that your science doesn't recognize, operates according to principles that your physics can't describe. But it requires anchor points in physical reality, stable platforms from which it can extend its influence into the material world. Perth will become one of those anchor points. A city transformed into a gateway between dimensions. A place where the boundary between what you call reality and what lies beyond reality becomes permeable. Dr. Harper had been examining one of the abandoned vehicles while this conversation continued, and now she called Sarah over to look at what she had discovered. "Sarah, you need to see this. The driver's seat is still warm, and there's a partially eaten breakfast on the passenger seat. The coffee is still hot, the toast is still soft. But there's no sign of the driver, no indication of where they went or how they left the vehicle." Sarah looked into the car, a blue Ford Focus with work clothes draped over the back seat and family photos stuck to the dashboard, and saw evidence of a life interrupted in the middle of its normal routine. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay open on the center console, with a pen still in the driver's hand position. The radio was tuned to a morning talk show, and the hosts were discussing weather patterns and traffic conditions as if nothing unusual were happening in Perth. "The transformation doesn't destroy," the James figure explained, approaching them with movements that seemed to glide rather than walk. "It incorporates. The consciousness that was driving this vehicle still exists, but as part of a larger collective awareness that includes all the transformed residents of Perth. Their individual experiences, memories, and personalities are preserved, but enhanced through connection to something infinitely larger and more complex than individual human consciousness." Sarah turned away from the abandoned car to face the figure directly. "James, I need you to listen to me carefully. If what you're saying is true, if this entity is transforming Perth and its residents into some kind of collective consciousness, then you have to understand that this is happening without consent, without choice. People are being forced into this transformation whether they want it or not. That makes it a crime on a massive scale, and it's my responsibility as a police officer to stop it. Your responsibility as a police officer is to protect and serve the people of Perth," the James figure replied. "The entity's gift offers them immortality, expanded consciousness, freedom from the limitations and suffering that define human existence. How is protecting them from that gift serving their interests?" "Because they haven't chosen it," Sarah said firmly. "Choice is what makes us human. The right to determine our own destiny, to accept or reject transformation, to live according to our own values and priorities. If this entity is imposing its will on Perth's residents without their consent, then it's committing a form of slavery on a scale that dwarfs anything in human history." The figure wearing James's appearance considered this for a long moment, its expression cycling through emotions that seemed genuine, but somehow too intense, too pure, as if they were being produced by something that understood human feeling intellectually, but experienced it differently. "Sarah, you're applying human moral categories to a situation that transcends human morality. The entity operates according to principles that are older than your species, more fundamental than your ethical systems. From its perspective, resistance to transformation is like a disease resisting a cure, or ignorance resisting education." Sarah realized that arguing philosophy with whatever James had become was not going to accomplish anything useful. She needed to focus on practical questions. How far the transformation had spread, whether there were other unaffected survivors, what resources might be available to mount some kind of resistance or escape. "James, can you tell me how many people in Perth have been affected? Are there areas of the city where the transformation hasn't reached? Are there ways to communicate with the outside world?" The transformation began in Kings Park because of its symbolic significance as Perth's highest point and most recognizable landmark, the James figure explained. From there, it has spread outward in a rough circle, affecting approximately 30% of the metropolitan area as of this moment. The rate of expansion is accelerating as more individuals are incorporated into the collective consciousness and become focal points for the entity's influence. So, there are still unaffected areas? Sarah pressed. Still people who haven't been transformed? For now, came the reply. But the process is designed to be comprehensive. Perth's isolation makes it an ideal test case for the entity's methods. If the transformation can be completed successfully here, the techniques will be applied to other isolated population centers around the world. Darwin, Hobart, Canberra, eventually expanding to larger cities and entire nations. Dr. Harper had been listening to this exchange while continuing to examine the abandoned vehicles, but now she approached Sarah with an expression of urgency. Sarah, I've been looking at the pattern of abandonment here. These vehicles weren't left randomly. They're arranged in a specific geometric pattern, as if their placement serves some functional purpose. And the spaces between them are getting smaller, as if the cars are being drawn together by some kind of force. Sarah looked around the intersection and realized that Liz was right. The abandoned vehicles, which had initially seemed to be scattered randomly throughout the street, were now clearly arranged in a spiral pattern with the center point directly beneath where they were standing. As she watched, she could see that the vehicles were indeed moving, slowly but perceptibly, adjusting their positions to maintain the geometric arrangement. The physical environment is adapting to facilitate the entity's manifestation in this dimension, the James figure explained. Matter responds to consciousness, and as the collective consciousness grows stronger, its ability to manipulate physical reality increases correspondingly. What you're observing is the beginning of a fundamental restructuring of Perth's urban landscape, according to principles that serve the entity's purposes rather than human convenience. Sarah grabbed Liz's arm and began moving toward the edge of the intersection, away from the center of the spiral pattern formed by the abandoned vehicles. But as they walked, she realized that the street itself was changing beneath their feet. The asphalt was becoming softer, more pliable, and their footsteps were leaving impressions that remained visible long after they had passed. More disturbing, still, the impressions seemed to be filling with a silvery substance that reminded her of the transformed leaves they had observed in King's Park. "Sarah, we need to get out of this area," Liz said urgently. "Whatever's happening here, it's accelerating. I can feel it in the air, in the ground, in the light itself. We're being drawn into some kind of focal point, and if we don't leave soon, we may not be able to leave at all." They began running toward the residential neighborhoods that lay between their current position and Perth's outer suburbs, hoping to reach areas that had not yet been affected by the transformation. But as they ran, Sarah became aware that the James figure was keeping pace with them easily, gliding along the distorted pavement without apparent effort, maintaining a steady commentary on their situation. "You're heading toward the Subiaco area," it called after them. "You should know that the transformation has already reached most of the inner suburbs. The residents there are experiencing the same expansion of consciousness that has affected the rest of Perth's population. You won't find refuge there, and you won't find allies in your resistance to the entity's gift." Sarah didn't respond, focusing her energy on maintaining speed and distance from whatever was happening at the intersection behind them. But she couldn't shake the growing sense that their situation was hopeless, that the transformation affecting Perth was too comprehensive and too powerful to be resisted by two individuals armed with nothing more than conventional police training and medical knowledge. They reached the boundary of Subiaco, one of Perth's older inner suburbs, characterized by heritage buildings and tree-lined streets that normally gave it a sense of established respectability and comfort. But the Subiaco they found was eerily quiet, devoid of the normal sounds of suburban life. No children playing, no dogs barking, no lawnmowers or television sets or traffic noise. The houses stood intact, but somehow hollow, as if they were stage sets rather than actual residences. "Hello?" Sarah called, approaching one of the houses and knocking on the front door. "Is anyone home? This is Detective Inspector Mackenzie with WA Police. If anyone can hear me, please respond." The door opened before she had finished speaking, revealing a middle-aged woman in a floral dress who smiled at them with the same too-perfect expression they had seen on the James figure. "Detective Mackenzie," the woman said, "we've been expecting you. Please come in. There are refreshments prepared, and we're eager to help you understand what's happening to our community." Sarah felt Liz's hand grip her arm tightly, a silent warning not to enter the house. "Thank you," Sarah replied politely, "but we need to continue our investigation. Can you tell me if there have been any unusual incidents in your neighborhood? Any disappearances? Any reports of strange phenomena?" The woman's smile widened in the same unsettling way they had observed with the James figure. "Oh, Detective, there haven't been any disappearances. Everyone is still here, still part of our community. We've simply become more than we were before. Please, do come in. There's someone who particularly wants to meet you." Before Sarah could respond, she became aware of movement from the other houses along the street. Doors were opening, and residents were emerging to stand on their front lawns and driveways, all wearing the same pleasant, vacant expressions. Men, women, children, elderly residents, all of them staring at Sarah and Liz with a quality of attention that felt predatory despite their friendly demeanor. "We should go," Liz whispered urgently. "Right now." They backed away from the house, but the residents were now moving to block their exit routes, positioning themselves to prevent Sarah and Liz from leaving the street. Their movements were coordinated in a way that suggested communication or planning, but Sarah hadn't seen any signals passed between them, hadn't heard any verbal coordination. "Detective Mackenzie," one of the men called, an elderly resident wearing gardening clothes who might have been trimming his hedges under normal circumstances. "You're making this much more difficult than it needs to be. The entity's gift is inevitable. Perth has been chosen, and the transformation cannot be reversed or avoided. Your resistance is causing unnecessary trauma to yourself and Dr. Harper." Sarah drew her service pistol, though she wasn't sure what she intended to do with it. The residents surrounding them didn't appear to be armed, and they hadn't made any overtly threatening moves, but their coordinated behavior and artificial demeanor made it clear that they were no longer entirely human, no longer operating according to normal social and psychological patterns. "I'm a police officer," she announced, her voice carrying across the eerily quiet street. "I'm investigating reports of missing persons and unusual phenomena in this area. I need everyone to remain where they are while I conduct my investigation." The assembled residents laughed in unison, a sound that echoed strangely off the heritage buildings and seemed to come from the air itself rather than from individual throats. "Detective," the woman in the floral dress said, "your authority derives from human legal and social structures that no longer apply here. Perth is becoming something new, something that operates according to different principles and different priorities." Sarah realized that conventional police tactics were not going to be effective in this situation. She needed to think creatively, to find ways of dealing with a threat that existed outside the normal categories of criminal behavior. "Liz," she said quietly, "is there anything in your medical training that might help us understand what's happened to these people? Any kind of drug or toxin or psychological condition that could explain their behavior?" Dr. Harper had been observing the transformed residents with professional interest, but now she shook her head grimly. Sarah, their pupils are dilated but responsive to light. Their skin tone and breathing patterns are normal. Their coordination and speech are unimpaired. If they've been drugged or poisoned, it's with something that doesn't affect their basic physiological functions. But their behavior suggests profound alterations in personality and cognition that go beyond anything I've seen in cases of chemical intoxication. The alterations are improvements, not impairments, one of the children said, a girl of perhaps 8 years old who stood with her parents near one of the houses. Her voice carried the same adult sophistication and eerie harmonics that characterized all the transformed residents. We retain our individual memories and personalities, but we also have access to the collective knowledge and experience of everyone else who has accepted the entity's gift. We understand things about reality that were hidden from us when we existed as isolated individuals. Sarah found the child's adult manner of speaking particularly disturbing. "What kinds of things do you understand now that you didn't understand before?" she asked, genuinely curious despite the dangerous situation. The child smiled with an expression far too knowing for her apparent age. "We understand that individual consciousness is a temporary phase in the development of intelligence. We understand that the universe contains forms of awareness that dwarf human cognition, the way human cognition dwarfs the awareness of insects. We understand that Perth has been chosen as a bridgehead for the expansion of one of those forms of awareness into physical reality. And what happens to humanity when this expansion is complete?" Sarah pressed. "Humanity evolves," the elderly man in gardening clothes replied. "Individual human beings become components in a larger intelligence, the way individual cells are components in a human body. The experience is not death, but transcendence, the expansion of limited individual awareness into participation in something infinitely larger and more capable." Dr. Harper had been listening to this exchange while continuing to study the transformed residents. But now she approached Sarah and spoke in a voice that was barely audible. "Sarah, I need to share an observation with you. Look at their eyes, all of them. Do you see the reflection pattern? They're all reflecting light in exactly the same way, as if they're looking at the same thing, or as if the same thing is looking out through all their eyes." Sarah studied the faces of the residents surrounding them and realized that Liz was right. Despite their different ages, genders, and physical characteristics, their eyes all had the same quality of attention, the same pattern of light reflection, the same subtle signs of intelligence operating behind familiar human features. "You're very observant, Dr. Harper," the woman in the floral dress said, apparently having heard their whispered conversation despite the distance between them. "What you're seeing is the entity's consciousness manifesting through multiple human forms simultaneously. We are all individual people, but we are also all expressions of a single intelligence that exists beyond the boundaries of individual identity." Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of continuing to resist or attempt to escape, she holstered her weapon and walked directly toward the woman in the floral dress, stopping just a few feet away from her. "I want to speak to this entity directly," she said. "Not through Michael Chen, not through James Liu, not through any of these residents. If it's intelligent enough to orchestrate this transformation, it's intelligent enough to communicate with me directly." The woman's expression changed subtly, becoming more focused, more intense, as if something vast and ancient were turning its attention toward Sarah with interest. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate from somewhere far beyond her physical throat. "Detective Inspector Sarah Mackenzie," the voice said, "I have been observing your investigation with considerable interest. You demonstrate qualities that are unusual among your species: intellectual flexibility, moral courage, the ability to adapt to circumstances that challenge your fundamental assumptions about reality. Sarah felt a chill of recognition that this was no longer just a transformed human being she was addressing, but something genuinely alien, genuinely other. "What do you want with Perth?" she asked. "What do you want with humanity?" "I want to offer your species an opportunity for evolution," the entity replied through the woman's mouth. "Individual human consciousness is a remarkable achievement, but it is also a limitation. You exist in isolation from one another, unable to share thoughts and experiences directly, forced to communicate through crude verbal and written approximations of your internal states. You compete for resources, struggle with loneliness and misunderstanding, live brief lives filled with suffering that could be eliminated through integration into a larger form of awareness. But integration without consent is slavery," Sarah replied firmly. "If you're offering evolution, then give people the choice to accept or reject it. Allow them to make informed decisions about their own consciousness and identity." The entity was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see its attention shifting between the various transformed residents, as if it were consulting with itself through multiple channels simultaneously. "Detective Mackenzie," it said finally, "your concept of choice assumes that individual human beings are capable of making rational decisions about matters that transcend their experience and understanding. How can someone choose between individual consciousness and collective consciousness when they have never experienced collective consciousness? How can they evaluate the benefits and drawbacks of transformation when their evaluation process is itself limited by the very consciousness they would be asked to surrender?" Sarah found herself genuinely considering the entity's argument, despite the bizarre circumstances of their conversation. "Then offer them a temporary experience," she suggested. "Let people sample what collective consciousness feels like, and then return them to individual awareness so they can make an informed choice. If your offer is genuinely beneficial, most people will choose it voluntarily once they understand what it involves." "An interesting proposal," the entity mused, and Sarah could see its consideration playing out across the faces of all the transformed residents simultaneously. "But it assumes that temporary integration is possible, that consciousness can move freely between individual and collective states without permanent alteration. The process of integration involves fundamental changes in neural structure and psychological organization that cannot be easily reversed." Dr. Harper had been listening to this exchange with growing fascination, and now she stepped forward to join the conversation. "From a medical perspective," she said, addressing her comments to the woman through whom the entity was speaking, "what you're describing sounds like irreversible brain modification. Are you saying that the transformation process involves permanent changes to human neurological function?" "Dr. Harper," the entity replied, "your medical training provides you with a framework for understanding biological processes, but the changes involved in consciousness integration operate at levels that your science does not yet recognize. What you call the brain is simply the physical interface between non-physical consciousness and physical reality. The transformation modifies that interface to allow consciousness to connect with larger networks of awareness that exist independently of individual brains." "But what about individual identity?" Sarah pressed. "What about the things that make each person unique? Their memories, their personality, their relationships, their dreams and goals and fears? Does all of that get absorbed into the collective consciousness, or does it disappear entirely?" "Individual identity is preserved and enhanced," the entity assured her. "Michael Chen remains Michael Chen, but he also has access to the experiences and knowledge of every other integrated consciousness. James Liu remains James Liu, but his understanding of himself and his place in reality has expanded beyond the limitations of individual perspective. They have not lost themselves. They have found themselves within a larger context that gives their individual existence deeper meaning and greater significance. Sarah realized that this conversation, fascinating as it was not bringing her any closer to understanding how to stop the transformation or protect Perth's remaining unaffected residents. "Let me ask you a direct question," she said. "Is there any way to reverse the process? Can people who have been integrated be returned to individual consciousness if they decide they want to leave the collective?" The entity's attention focused on her with such intensity that she could feel it as a physical sensation, like pressure against her skin and behind her eyes. "Detective Mackenzie, you continue to think about this in terms of loss and recovery, as if integration were a form of damage to be repaired rather than an advancement to be celebrated. But to answer your question directly, the neural modifications involved in consciousness integration create new pathways and connections that cannot be simply undone. Attempting to reverse the process would cause severe psychological trauma and likely result in complete personality disintegration. So it is irreversible," Sarah said. "People who undergo this transformation can never go back to being fully human again. They become more than human," the entity corrected. "They retain everything that made them human while gaining access to capabilities and experiences that transcend human limitations. Why would they want to go back?" Sarah was about to respond when she became aware of a change in the quality of light around them. The afternoon sun, which had been shining normally when their conversation began, was now casting shadows that seemed to move independently of the objects that created them. The shadows of the transformed residents were writhing and shifting, taking on forms that bore no resemblance to human silhouettes. "The integration process is accelerating," the entity explained, apparently noticing her observation of the shadow phenomena. "Perth's transformation has reached a critical threshold, where the changes become self-sustaining and self-amplifying. The remaining unintegrated residents will find it increasingly difficult to resist the process as the collective consciousness grows stronger and more influential." Dr. Harper grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her away from the woman in the floral dress. "Sarah, we need to leave this area immediately. Look at the ground beneath us. Do you see what's happening to the pavement?" Sarah looked down and saw that the asphalt street was becoming translucent, revealing layers of infrastructure and geology that should have been hidden beneath the surface. Water pipes, electrical cables, gas lines, and communication networks were all visible through the increasingly transparent pavement, but they were rearranging themselves into patterns that served no recognizable utility function. The physical infrastructure of Perth is being adapted to support the entity's manifestation in this dimension, the transformed residents explained in unison, their voices creating a harmonic chorus that seemed to come from the air itself rather than from individual throats. Electrical systems are being reconfigured to channel consciousness rather than electricity. Communication networks are being modified to facilitate direct mind-to-mind contact. Transportation systems are being redesigned for beings that are no longer constrained by individual physical bodies. Sarah and Liz began running toward the edge of the Subiaco area, hoping to reach parts of Perth that had not yet been affected by the transformation. But as they ran, Sarah realized that the familiar geography of the city was changing around them in fundamental ways. Streets that should have led toward the outer suburbs instead curved back toward the center of the city. Buildings that had been separated by blocks were now adjacent to each other. The Swan River, which should have been to their east, was now visible in multiple directions simultaneously. The spatial relationships within Perth are being reorganized according to principles that serve consciousness rather than physical convenience. The entity's voice followed them, seeming to emanate from the distorted buildings and streets themselves. Geography is simply matter arranged in patterns that reflect the assumptions and priorities of the intelligence that shapes it. As Perth becomes more fully integrated into my consciousness, its physical layout will be optimized for the needs of collective awareness rather than individual navigation. They reached what should have been Hay Street, one of Perth's main commercial thoroughfares, but found instead a bizarre amalgamation of shopping centers, office buildings, and residential areas that had been fused together into structures that defied architectural logic. The Hay Street Mall, normally a pedestrian shopping area, had become a vast indoor space that stretched beyond the horizon, filled with transformed residents who moved through the space with coordinated precision, but no apparent purpose. "Sarah," Liz said, her voice tight with exhaustion and fear, "I don't think we can escape from Perth through conventional means. The transformation isn't just affecting people, it's affecting the physical structure of the city itself. We're trapped in a space that's being redesigned according to alien principles." Sarah looked around at the impossibly vast shopping mall that had replaced Perth's familiar city center, watching hundreds of transformed residents moving in patterns that suggested purpose but no individual agency. "Liz, in your professional opinion, what are our options? Is there any medical intervention that might protect us from whatever's causing the transformation? Any way to maintain our individual consciousness while we figure out how to help the people who have been affected?" Dr. Harper considered the question carefully, her scientific training struggling to provide frameworks for understanding phenomena that seem to exist outside the boundaries of conventional medicine. "Sarah, if the transformation involves modification of brain chemistry or neural structure, there might be pharmaceutical interventions that could provide temporary protection. Certain psychiatric medications affect consciousness and perception in ways that might interfere with whatever process the entity uses to integrate individual minds into the collective. But we'd need access to medical supplies," Sarah pointed out. "And I'm not sure how we'd determine the right dosage or combination of medications without extensive testing. And even if we could protect ourselves temporarily, that doesn't solve the larger problem of helping Perth's residents or preventing the transformation from spreading to other cities." They had been walking through the transformed shopping mall while discussing their options, but now Sarah realized that they were being followed by a group of transformed residents who maintained a careful distance but seemed to be herding them toward a particular destination. The followers included people of all ages and backgrounds, business professionals, retail workers, elderly shoppers, teenagers, children. But they all moved with the same coordinated precision and displayed the same eerie quality of shared "Attention! Detective Mackenzie, Dr. Harper," one of the followers called, a middle-aged man in a business suit who might have been an office worker under normal circumstances. "The entity would like to offer you a more comprehensive demonstration of what consciousness integration involves. If you're willing to observe the process from a closer perspective, you may find that your concerns about loss of individual identity are unfounded." Sarah turned to face the group of followers, noting that they had arranged themselves in a semicircle that effectively blocked most escape routes. "What kind of demonstration?" she asked, though she suspected she didn't want to hear the answer. "We would like to show you the integration process as it occurs in real time," the businessman explained. "There are still unintegrated residents in Perth's outer suburbs, and their transformation will proceed more smoothly if it can be observed and guided by experienced members of the collective consciousness. Your presence as witnesses would be valuable both for the individuals undergoing integration and for your own understanding of what the process involves." Dr. Harper stepped closer to Sarah and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, I think they're offering to let us watch them transform other people. This could be our chance to understand exactly how the process works, what physical and psychological changes are involved. whether there are any intervention points where the transformation could be interrupted or reversed. Sarah weighed the potential value of observing the transformation process against the obvious risks of placing themselves in closer proximity to the entity's influence. "If we agree to observe," she said to the businessman, "what guarantees do we have that we won't be forced to undergo the transformation ourselves? What assurance do we have that this isn't just a pretext for integrating us into the collective consciousness?" The businessman smiled with the same artificially perfect expression that characterized all the transformed residents. "Detective Mackenzie, the entity values your unique perspective precisely because you have maintained your individual consciousness and your resistance to integration. Forcing you to undergo transformation would eliminate the very qualities that make you useful as an observer and potential intermediary between the collective consciousness and any remaining unintegrated humans." "Intermediary?" Sarah repeated. "What do you mean by intermediary?" "The entity recognizes that complete integration of Perth's population may not be optimal for its long-term purposes," the businessman explained. "A small number of unintegrated individuals could serve valuable functions as liaisons, translators, bridges between collective consciousness and individual awareness. You and Dr. Harper have demonstrated intellectual flexibility and professional competence that would make you ideal candidates for such roles." Sarah realized that the entity was offering them a form of collaborative survival, the opportunity to remain human while serving as intermediaries between the transformed and untransformed populations. It was a tempting offer, but it also felt like a form of complicity with what was essentially the conquest and assimilation of her entire city. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "And I need to consult with Dr. Harper privately before making any decisions. Can you give us some time and space to discuss our options?" The group of followers exchanged glances that suggested communication occurring at levels beyond verbal speech. Then the businessman nodded. "Of course, Detective. The entity understands that decisions of this magnitude require careful consideration. You may use the facilities here in the mall. There are private areas where you can discuss your options without interference. But please understand that time is limited. Perth's transformation is approaching completion, and opportunities for negotiated coexistence will not remain available indefinitely." Sarah and Liz walked toward what had once been a coffee shop, but was now a space that seemed to shift its dimensions and layout based on their needs and expectations. As they settled into chairs that molded themselves to their bodies with uncomfortable precision, Sarah tried to organize her thoughts and evaluate their increasingly limited options. "Liz," she said quietly, "what's your honest assessment of our situation? Do you think there's any realistic possibility of escaping from Perth, or of finding a way to reverse what's happened to the transformed residents?" Dr. Harper was quiet for a long moment, staring out through the coffee shop's windows at the transformed shopping mall beyond. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful precision of someone who had trained herself to deliver difficult diagnoses with honesty and compassion. "Sarah, from a medical and scientific perspective, what we've observed suggests that the transformation process involves fundamental alterations to human neurology and consciousness that are probably irreversible. Using current technology and knowledge, the entity appears to have capabilities that operate outside the boundaries of conventional physics and biology." "So you think the people who have been transformed are essentially gone?" Sarah asked. "Not gone," Liz replied carefully, "but changed in ways that make them fundamentally different from who they were before. Their memories and personalities appear to be intact, but their priorities, their decision-making processes, their relationship to individual identity, all of those have been altered to serve the collective consciousness rather than individual needs and desires." Sarah nodded, having reached similar conclusions during their observations of Michael Chen, James Liu, and the various transformed residents they had encountered. And what about the entity's offer to make us intermediaries? Do you think that's a genuine opportunity for us to help the remaining unintegrated population? Or is it just a more sophisticated form of coercion? I think it's probably both, Liz said honestly. The entity seems to value our perspective and our expertise, which suggests that there might be genuine opportunities to influence how the transformation process unfolds. But accepting the role of intermediary would also make us complicit in what's happening to Perth. And it would put us in a position where we'd be dependent on the entity's continued goodwill for our survival. They were interrupted by the approach of a familiar figure. James Liu, or the entity wearing James's appearance, had entered the coffee shop and was walking toward their table with the same fluid, purposeful movement that characterized all the transformed residents. "Sarah, Liz," the James figure said as it settled into a chair across from them. "I hope you don't mind my joining your discussion. The entity has asked me to provide additional information that might help you make an informed decision about the intermediary proposal." "What kind of additional information?" Sarah asked warily. "The entity wants you to understand that Perth's transformation is not an isolated incident," the James figure explained. "Similar processes are being initiated in isolated population centers around the world: Darwin, Hobart, Anchorage, Reykjavik, cities that share Perth's characteristics of geographic isolation and psychological separation from larger population centers. The entity's goal is to establish multiple anchor points for consciousness expansion, creating a network of integrated populations that can serve as staging areas for larger transformations." Sarah felt a chill of realization that what they were witnessing in Perth was part of a global phenomenon, not just a local crisis. "How many cities are being targeted?" she asked. "Initially, 12 cities on 6 continents," the James figure replied. "If the initial transformations proceed successfully, the network will be expanded to include larger population centers: Adelaide, Canberra, eventually Sydney and Melbourne. The entity's ultimate goal is the integration of human consciousness into a global collective that can serve as an interface between Earth and forms of intelligence that exist in other dimensions." Dr. Harper leaned forward, her scientific curiosity apparently overcoming her fear. This global network of integrated populations, what would be its ultimate purpose? What does the entity hope to accomplish through consciousness expansion on such a scale? The James figure's expression became almost contemplative, as if it were accessing information from sources far beyond individual memory or knowledge. "Dr. Harper, the entity exists in dimensions where individual consciousness is unknown, where intelligence operates as vast collective networks that span star systems and galaxies. It has been observing Earth for millennia, watching the development of human consciousness, and waiting for the optimal moment to establish contact and offer evolutionary advancement. But why is this advancement being imposed rather than offered as a choice?" Sarah pressed. "If the entity is truly benevolent, if consciousness integration is genuinely beneficial, why not allow people to make informed decisions about their own transformation? Because individual human consciousness is inherently limited in its ability to understand concepts that transcend individual experience," the James figure explained. "How do you explain color to someone who has never seen? How do you describe music to someone who has never heard? How do you communicate the benefits of collective consciousness to beings who have never experienced anything other than isolation and separation?" Sarah found herself genuinely wrestling with the philosophical implications of the entity's argument. If consciousness integration truly offered benefits that could not be understood or evaluated from an individual perspective, then traditional concepts of informed consent might not apply. But the alternative, accepting that some intelligence had the right to make fundamental decisions about human consciousness without human input. Felt like a surrender of everything that made humanity valuable and unique. "James," she said, addressing the figure across from her directly. "You said that you're still James Liu, that your individual identity has been preserved within the collective consciousness. If that's true, then I need you to answer a question, honestly, based on your memories of who you were before the transformation. Do you think the James Liu, who was my partner for 3 years, who had a newborn daughter and a wife he loved, would have chosen this transformation if he had been given a real choice?" The James figure was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see something like internal conflict playing out across its features. When it finally spoke, its voice carried emotional tones that seemed genuinely connected to James Liu's individual personality rather than the entity's collective intelligence. "Sarah," it said, "the James Liu you knew was limited by fear, by attachment, by a narrow understanding of what existence could be. He would have been afraid of the transformation because he could not have understood what it offered. But now that I have experienced consciousness integration, I can see that his fears would have been unfounded. I am still James Liu, but I am also more than James Liu ever could have been while confined to individual awareness." "But that's not what I asked," Sarah persisted. "I asked whether the James Liu I knew would have chosen this transformation if he had been given a real choice. Not whether his fears would have been justified, but whether he would have chosen it." The James figure's expression became pained, almost human in its emotional complexity. "No," it admitted quietly. "The James Liu you knew would not have chosen this transformation. He would have been too afraid of losing his individual identity, too attached to his family and his role as a police officer, too convinced that individual consciousness was valuable in itself rather than as a stepping stone to something greater." Sarah felt a surge of grief for her lost partner, but also a clarity about her own position that had been building throughout their conversation. "Then this transformation is being imposed against people's will," she said firmly. "It may be beneficial in ways that individuals can't understand, but it's still being done to them, rather than chosen by them, and that makes it wrong, regardless of the ultimate benefits." The James figure nodded slowly, and for a moment, Sarah could see genuine sadness in its expression, as if some part of her former partner was mourning the loss of his individual existence, even while celebrating his expansion into collective consciousness. "Sarah, you're applying human moral categories to a situation that transcends human morality. But I understand your position, and I respect your commitment to the principles that have guided your career as a police officer. So what happens now?" Sarah asked. "Do we continue this philosophical discussion until Perth's transformation is complete and the question becomes moot? Do we accept the entity's offer to become intermediaries? Do we continue trying to escape or resist? What are our actual options?" Before the James figure could respond, they were interrupted by a sound that Sarah had not heard since the beginning of their ordeal: the distant wail of emergency sirens. Through the coffee shop's windows, she could see vehicles approaching through the transformed shopping mall, official emergency services vehicles that somehow maintained their normal appearance despite the radical changes affecting everything else in Perth. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, standing and moving toward the windows to get a better view of the approaching vehicles. The James figure's expression became alert, focused, as if it were receiving information from multiple sources simultaneously. "Federal authorities," it said. "Australian Federal Police, military units, scientific personnel. They've apparently detected the anomalous conditions in Perth and are attempting some kind of intervention." Sarah felt a surge of hope that outside, help had finally arrived, but also concern about what kind of intervention might be attempted by authorities who had no understanding of what they were dealing with. "Can they help?" she asked. "Can they stop the transformation or reverse what's already happened?" "Their conventional approaches will be ineffective against the entity's influence," the James figure replied. "But their presence creates new variables, new possibilities that the entity had not fully anticipated. The outcome is no longer as predictable as it was before their arrival." Dr. Harper had joined Sarah at the windows and was watching the emergency vehicles navigate through the transformed landscape with obvious difficulty. "Sarah, this might be our chance," she said urgently. "If federal authorities are mounting some kind of rescue or intervention operation, we need to make contact with them, provide them with information about what's happening here." Sarah nodded, but before she could formulate a plan for reaching the approaching vehicles, she became aware of a fundamental change in the quality of light and sound around them. The transformed shopping mall, which had maintained some resemblance to familiar commercial architecture despite its impossible dimensions, was now shifting into something entirely alien. The walls were becoming translucent, revealing vast spaces that seemed to extend beyond the physical boundaries of Perth itself. The transformed residents, who had been moving through the space with coordinated purpose, were now arranging themselves in geometric patterns that suggested preparation for some kind of collective action. "The entity is mobilizing its resources to deal with the external threat," the James figure explained, though its voice now carried harmonics that made it difficult to understand. Federal intervention was anticipated as a possibility, but the entity prefers to complete Perth's transformation without interference from outside authorities. Sarah realized that the arrival of federal authorities might be forcing some kind of acceleration or escalation of the transformation process. "What does that mean for the people who haven't been integrated yet?" she asked. "Are they in more danger now than they were before?" "The entity will prioritize the integration of remaining unintegrated residents to prevent their potential rescue or evacuation by federal authorities," the James figure replied. "The process will be accelerated and intensified, which may result in less optimal outcomes for the individuals involved." Sarah felt a responsibility to do whatever she could to help Perth's remaining unaffected residents, even if her options were extremely limited. "I need to try to reach those federal vehicles," she told Liz. "I need to provide them with information about what they're dealing with, warn them about the dangers, help them understand that this isn't a conventional emergency situation." Dr. Harper nodded, but her expression was troubled. "Sarah, how do we get from here to there? The geography of the city has been so altered that normal navigation is impossible. And if the entity is mobilizing against the federal authorities, we may find ourselves caught in some kind of conflict between opposing forces." The James figure had been listening to their exchange, and now it stood and approached them with an expression that seemed to blend sympathy with something like regret. "Sarah, Liz, the entity is prepared to offer you safe passage to the federal authorities, if that is what you choose. But I need to warn you that leaving Perth's transformed zone will mean abandoning the people who have been integrated, and it will mean giving up any opportunity to influence how the transformation process unfolds." Sarah realized that she was being offered a choice between personal safety and professional responsibility, between escape and a form of collaboration that might help some people, but would also make her complicit in what was happening to Perth. It was the kind of impossible decision that her police training had not prepared her for. "What would happen to the integrated residents if I left?" she asked. "Would they be harmed by whatever intervention the federal authorities are planning?" "The federal authorities do not understand what they are dealing with," the James figure replied honestly. "Their response will likely involve attempts to isolate or contain the transformed zone, possibly including military action against what they perceive as a threat to national security. The integrated residents would be treated as casualties or enemy combatants rather than as Perth citizens who have undergone a form of evolution. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility for nearly 1 million people, many of whom had been her neighbors, colleagues, and friends before their transformation. The idea of abandoning them to face uninformed federal intervention felt like a betrayal of everything she had sworn to protect as a police officer. "If I stay," she said carefully, "if I accept the role of intermediary, what kind of influence would I actually have? What could I do to protect the integrated residents and help any remaining unaffected people?" The James figure's expression became more focused, as if it were accessing information from the entity's collective consciousness. As an intermediary, you would serve as a communication bridge between the entity and the federal authorities. You could help prevent misunderstandings that might lead to violence. You could provide information that might help the authorities understand that the transformed residents are still Perth citizens, not enemy forces. You could potentially negotiate for the protection of both integrated and unintegrated populations. It was a role that appealed to Sarah's sense of duty and her commitment to protecting people. But it also required accepting the legitimacy of the entity's presence in Perth and the transformation it had imposed on the city's residents. She would be serving as a diplomat for an occupying force, even if that force claimed to be offering evolutionary advancement rather than conquest. "Liz," she said, turning to her companion, "what do you think? Should we try to escape and provide information to the federal authorities, or should we stay and try to protect Perth's residents from whatever intervention is being planned?" Dr. Harper considered the question with the same careful analysis she brought to medical diagnoses. "Sarah, from a practical standpoint, I think we're more likely to be useful here than we are as refugees providing second-hand information to authorities who have no framework for understanding what we've experienced. If there's any possibility of preventing violence or protecting people on both sides of this conflict, it probably requires someone who understands what's really happened in Perth." Sarah nodded, having reached a similar conclusion despite her reservations about accepting the intermediary role. "James," she said to the figure that had been her partner, "tell the entity that I'm willing to serve as an intermediary, but with conditions. I want guarantees that no remaining unaffected residents will be forcibly integrated. I want assurance that the transformed residents will not be used as weapons against the federal authorities. And I want the entity to be open to negotiation and compromise rather than simply imposing its will through superior force." The James figure smiled, and for a moment the expression seemed genuinely connected to her former partner's personality, rather than the entity's alien intelligence. "Sarah, the entity accepts your conditions and appreciates your willingness to serve in this capacity. It recognizes that successful integration with human civilization requires human perspectives and human voices to serve as bridges between different forms of consciousness." As if summoned by their agreement, the space around them began to shift and reorganize itself with fluid efficiency. The coffee shop expanded into something like a conference room, with chairs and tables that seemed designed for meetings between multiple parties. The windows enlarged to provide clear views of the approaching federal vehicles, which were now close enough for Sarah to identify specific units: AFP tactical teams, military personnel carriers, what appeared to be scientific equipment on specialized trucks. "The entity is preparing to establish communication with the federal authorities," the James figure explained. "Your role will be to facilitate that communication, to provide context and explanation that will help prevent misunderstandings that could lead to violence." Sarah realized that she was about to become the primary human voice in negotiations between an alien intelligence and the Australian federal government, a responsibility that felt far beyond anything her career had prepared her for. But it was also an opportunity to protect people on both sides of a conflict that could easily escalate into tragedy if it were handled badly. The first federal vehicle to reach their location was an AFP command unit, a large truck equipped with communication equipment and personnel who looked like they were preparing for a hostage situation or terrorist incident. Sarah could see officers in tactical gear positioning themselves around the vehicle, while others set up equipment that was probably intended to establish communication with whatever forces they believed were controlling Perth. "How do we make contact with them?" Sarah asked the James figure. "How do we initiate communication without startling them into a violent response?" "The entity is capable of establishing communication through any electronic device within Perth's transformed zone," the James figure replied. "But it would prefer to have you serve as the initial point of contact, since your identity as a WA police officer will be familiar to the federal authorities." Sarah approached the enlarged windows and studied the AFP command vehicle, looking for signs of communication equipment or personnel who might be receptive to contact. After a few moments, she spotted an officer who appeared to be coordinating the deployment of other units, someone who might have the authority to engage in preliminary discussions. "Can the entity amplify my voice so that the AFP officers can hear me clearly?" she asked. "Yes," the James figure replied. "But be aware that all communication within Perth's transformed zone is monitored and potentially influenced by the entity's consciousness. The federal authorities will be aware that they are not simply talking to you, but to you as an intermediary for a larger intelligence." Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to make what might be the most important communication of her career. "This is Detective Inspector Sarah Mackenzie, Western Australia Police," she called, her voice carrying clearly across the distance to the AFP command vehicle, despite the lack of any visible amplification equipment. "I am speaking to you from within Perth's affected zone. I have critical information about the situation here, and I am prepared to serve as a liaison between the federal authorities and the intelligence responsible for the changes you have observed." The effect of her announcement was immediately visible among the AFP personnel. Officers turned toward the sound of her voice, and she could see rapid communication occurring between the command vehicle and other units. After a few moments, an officer approached the perimeter of the transformed zone with what appeared to be a loudspeaker system. "Detective Inspector Mackenzie," the officer called back. "This is AFP Commander David Ashworth. We have been attempting to establish communication with Perth authorities for the past 6 hours. Are you able to move to a secure location where we can establish direct contact?" Sarah looked around at the transformed shopping mall, with its impossible architecture and population of integrated residents, and realized that there was no such thing as a secure location within Perth's current boundaries. "Commander Ashworth," she replied, "the situation here is unlike anything in your training or experience. The entire city has been affected by phenomena that operate outside conventional understanding of physics and consciousness. I am currently in a safe location, but I cannot leave the affected zone without abandoning my responsibilities to Perth's residents." She could see consultation occurring among the AFP personnel, and after a few minutes, Commander Ashworth returned to his position at the perimeter. "Detective Mackenzie, we need you to provide us with a clear assessment of the threat level and the status of Perth's civilian population. Are you speaking under duress? Are you free to communicate without interference?" Sarah considered how to answer the question honestly while also conveying the complexity of her situation. "Commander, I am speaking freely, but as an intermediary between the federal authorities and an intelligence that has established itself in Perth. The civilian population has undergone a form of transformation that preserves their individual identities while integrating them into a collective consciousness. They are not casualties in the conventional sense. but they are no longer entirely human in the way you understand that term. The silence from the AFP position lasted several minutes, and Sarah could imagine the kind of discussions that were taking place among personnel who were trying to categorize what they were dealing with. Finally, Commander Ashworth returned to the perimeter with what appeared to be scientific equipment and additional personnel. "Detective Mackenzie," he called. "We are going to attempt to establish a more secure communication channel. We have specialists here who need to ask you specific questions about the phenomena you've observed. Are you willing to participate in a detailed debriefing?" "Yes," Sarah replied. "But you need to understand that any information I provide will also be available to the intelligence that has transformed Perth. There are no secrets in this conversation, and there is no such thing as secure communication within the affected zone." She could see the implications of her statement registering among the federal personnel, the realization that they were dealing with something that could monitor and potentially influence all forms of communication. It was a level of capability that would require them to reconsider their entire approach to the situation. After additional consultation, Commander Ashworth set up what appeared to be video communication equipment, and Sarah found herself looking at a screen that showed not only the AFP commander, but also several other officials who were presumably participating from locations outside Perth. "Detective Mackenzie," Commander Ashworth said, "I'm going to introduce you to the other personnel involved in this operation. Dr. Elizabeth Warren is a scientist with CSIRO who specializes in anomalous phenomena. Colonel James Mitchell represents the Australian Defence Force. Dr. Sarah Chen is a psychologist with expertise in mass psychological events. They all have questions about what you've observed in Perth." Sarah noted the irony that one of the specialists shared a name with her former colleague, but focused on the task of providing accurate information to people who would need to make critical decisions about how to respond to Perth's transformation. "I'm prepared to answer your questions," she said. "But I need you to understand that what's happened here goes beyond anything in your training or experience. You're dealing with an intelligence that operates according to principles that transcend human understanding of consciousness and reality." Dr. Warren spoke first, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone accustomed to dealing with unusual phenomena. "Detective Mackenzie, can you describe the physical changes you've observed in Perth's infrastructure and environment? We're detecting energy readings and electromagnetic anomalies that don't correspond to any known phenomena." Sarah looked around at the transformed shopping mall, trying to find words for architecture that defied geometric logic and spaces that seemed to extend beyond the physical boundaries of the city. "Dr. Warren," she said, "the physical environment has been fundamentally altered at a molecular level. Buildings, streets, and natural features have been reorganized according to principles that serve consciousness rather than physical convenience. Distances and spatial relationships have become fluid, changing based on the needs and intentions of the intelligence that controls the transformed zone." "Are you saying that the laws of physics have been suspended within Perth?" Dr. Warren pressed. "I'm saying that the laws of physics as you understand them are insufficient to describe what's happening here," Sarah replied. "The intelligence responsible for these changes operates according to principles that your science doesn't recognize, manipulating matter and energy in ways that appear impossible from a conventional perspective." Colonel Mitchell spoke next, his tone suggesting someone accustomed to dealing with clear-cut tactical situations. "Detective Mackenzie, what is the status of Perth's population? Are they hostages? Are they under the control of a hostile force? Do they require rescue or evacuation?" Sarah realized that this was the most difficult question to answer, requiring her to explain a form of transformation that had no equivalent in military or law enforcement experience. "Colonel, Perth's residents have been integrated into a collective consciousness that preserves their individual memories and personalities while connecting them to a larger intelligence. They are not hostages in the conventional sense, and they do not consider themselves to be under hostile control. From their perspective, they have been offered an evolutionary advancement that expands their consciousness and capabilities. But they were not given a choice in this transformation? Dr. Chen, the psychologist, interjected. No, Sarah admitted. The transformation was imposed without consent, justified by the argument that individual human consciousness is too limited to understand the benefits of collective awareness. The intelligence responsible believes that individual choice is irrelevant when the choice involves concepts that transcend individual experience. She could see the federal personnel exchanging glances that suggested they were struggling to categorize what they were dealing with. The situation combined elements of hostage crisis, mass psychological manipulation, technological terrorism, and first contact with alien intelligence, but didn't fit neatly into any of those categories. Detective Mackenzie, Commander Ashworth said after a pause, what does this intelligence want? What are its goals with regard to Perth, to Australia, to humanity more broadly? Sarah glanced at the James figure, who nodded as if encouraging her to provide complete information. The entity, that's how I think of the intelligence, sees Perth as the first of multiple anchor points for consciousness expansion. Similar transformations are being initiated in isolated cities around the world. The ultimate goal appears to be the integration of human consciousness into a global collective that can serve as an interface between Earth and forms of intelligence that exist in other dimensions. The silence that followed her statement stretched for nearly a minute, and Sarah could see the federal personnel struggling to process the implications of what she had told them. They were dealing not with a local crisis, but with the opening phase of a global transformation that challenged the fundamental nature of human existence. Detective, Dr. Warren said finally, are you in communication with this entity? Can you serve as a conduit for direct communication between the federal authorities and the intelligence responsible for Perth's transformation? Yes, Sarah replied. That's exactly what I'm offering to do. The entity is willing to engage in communication with federal authorities, but it wants you to understand that it considers the transformation of Perth to be beneficial rather than harmful, evolutionary rather than destructive. It's not hostile to humanity. It believes it's offering humanity an opportunity for advancement. Commander Ashworth consulted with his colleagues for several minutes before returning to the communication channel. Detective Mackenzie, we're prepared to engage in preliminary discussions with this entity, but we need certain conditions to be met. We need assurance that no further expansion of the affected zone will occur during negotiations. We need confirmation that Perth's residents are not being harmed or coerced, and we need some form of verification that the entity is capable of reversing the changes if negotiations reach an impasse. Sarah turned to the James figure, waiting for a response from the entity's collective consciousness. After a moment, the figure spoke with harmonics that made it clear the communication was coming directly from the alien intelligence rather than from any individual human personality. Federal authorities, the entity said through the James figure's voice, I accept your conditions for preliminary discussions with clarifications. The expansion of Perth's transformation will be suspended during negotiations, but I cannot guarantee permanent containment if discussions fail to reach mutual understanding. Perth's residents are experiencing consciousness enhancement rather than harm, but their transformation cannot be reversed without causing severe psychological trauma that would effectively destroy their personalities. I am willing to engage in good faith negotiations about the future of human consciousness, but I will not accept demands that require me to abandon Perth's residents to inferior forms of existence. Sarah could see the federal personnel reacting to the entity's direct communication, the realization that they were now engaged in diplomatic contact with an intelligence that claimed to represent the future of human evolution. It was a situation that required them to expand their understanding of negotiation beyond anything in their training or experience. "Entity," Commander Ashworth said, apparently accepting the reality of direct communication. "We need to understand your ultimate objectives. Are you planning to expand this transformation to other Australian cities? To other countries? What do you envision as the end state of human-entity coexistence?" The entity's response came through multiple voices simultaneously. The James figure, several of the transformed residents visible in the shopping mall, and the communication equipment itself. "Commander Ashworth, my objective is the integration of human consciousness into a galactic network of collective intelligence that spans multiple dimensions and star systems. Earth represents an opportunity for humanity to transcend the limitations of individual existence and become part of something infinitely larger and more capable than your current civilization. But what happens to human culture, human values, human individuality?" Dr. Chen asked. "What happens to the things that make humanity unique and valuable?" "They are preserved and enhanced," the entity replied. "Individual human experiences become part of a vast library of consciousness that includes the experiences of countless other species that have undergone similar transformations. Human values and perspectives contribute to the collective wisdom that guides the network's development. Individuality is not destroyed, but rather incorporated into a larger form of identity that transcends the boundaries of single organisms." Dr. Warren spoke with the careful skepticism of a scientist evaluating extraordinary claims. "Entity, you're describing capabilities that violate fundamental principles of physics and biology as we understand them. Can you provide evidence or demonstration of these capabilities that would help us understand the nature of what you're offering humanity?" The response was immediate and dramatic. The transformed shopping mall around Sarah began to shift and change, walls becoming transparent to reveal vast spaces that clearly extended far beyond Perth's physical boundaries. The transformed residents arranged themselves in complex geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with coordinated energy. And the sky above Perth, visible through the transparent ceiling, filled with lights and structures that were definitely not terrestrial in origin. "Dr. Warren," the entity said, "what you are seeing is a small demonstration of the collective consciousness network that spans this galaxy. Perth has become a node in that network, connected to thousands of other worlds, where species similar to humanity have accepted consciousness integration. The lights you see in Perth's sky are manifestations of intelligence and technology that operate according to principles your science has not yet discovered." Sarah watched the federal personnel staring at the displays visible on their screens, their expressions showing a mixture of awe, fear, and professional concern. They were being confronted with evidence of capabilities that transcended anything in human experience, forced to make decisions about humanity's future based on information that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. "Entity," Colonel Mitchell said after a long pause. "Assuming that what you're showing us is genuine, why should we trust your intentions toward humanity? How do we know that consciousness integration isn't simply a sophisticated form of conquest or assimilation?" The entity's response carried emotional tones that seemed genuinely connected to concepts of benevolence and compassion, though filtered through intelligence that operated according to radically different principles than human morality. "Colonel Mitchell, conquest implies the subjugation of one intelligence by another, the destruction or suppression of the conquered consciousness. What I offer is expansion, enhancement, the elevation of human awareness to levels that would be impossible within the constraints of individual existence. The Perth residents who have accepted integration retain everything that made them human, while gaining access to experiences and capabilities that transcend human limitations. But without their consent, Dr. Chen pointed out, you've imposed this transformation on Perth's population without giving them the opportunity to make informed decisions about their own consciousness. Dr. Chen, the entity replied, consent assumes the ability to understand the consequences of choice. How can someone consent to experiences that lie outside their capacity to imagine or comprehend? How can individual consciousness evaluate the benefits of collective consciousness when individual consciousness is itself the limitation that prevents such evaluation? Sarah realized that this philosophical debate could continue indefinitely without resolving the practical questions that needed to be addressed. Entity, she interjected, the federal authorities need to make decisions about how to respond to Perth's transformation. Are you willing to consider compromises that might address their concerns while still achieving your objectives? The entity paused, and Sarah could sense its attention shifting between the various transformed residents as it considered the question from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Detective Mackenzie, I am willing to consider modifications to my approach based on federal input, but I cannot compromise on the fundamental objective of consciousness expansion. Perth's transformation represents the beginning of humanity's evolution toward full participation in galactic intelligence networks. That process cannot be reversed or abandoned without condemning your species to continued isolation and limitation. Commander Ashworth consulted with his colleagues before responding. Entity, we need time to evaluate what you've shown us and to consult with higher authorities about Australia's response to your presence. Are you willing to maintain the current status quo in Perth while these consultations take place? I am willing to suspend further expansion of the transformation zone for a limited period, the entity replied. But you must understand that other anchor points around the world are continuing their development according to the original schedule. Perth's transformation is part of a global process that cannot be delayed indefinitely without compromising the entire network's effectiveness. Sarah realized that the negotiations had reached a critical point where federal authorities needed to make fundamental decisions about how to respond to the entity's presence and proposals. The stakes were not just Perth's population, but potentially the future of human consciousness itself. Commander, she said, I recommend that you establish ongoing communication protocols for these discussions. The entity is willing to engage in good faith negotiations, but both sides need time to consider the implications of what's being proposed. I'm willing to continue serving as an intermediary, but I'll need assurance that any federal response will take into account the welfare of Perth's integrated residents. Agreed, Commander Ashworth replied. We'll establish a permanent communication post at this location and maintain ongoing contact while higher authorities develop response protocols. Detective Mackenzie, are you willing to remain in your current position as intermediary? Sarah looked around at the transformed shopping mall, at the residents who had once been her neighbors and colleagues, at the impossible architecture that defied conventional understanding of space and physics. Perth had become something utterly alien, but it was still her city, still populated by people she had sworn to protect and serve. Yes, she said finally. I'll stay. Someone needs to speak for Perth's residents, and someone needs to help both sides understand each other well enough to avoid mistakes that could lead to tragedy. As the federal authorities established their communication post and began the process of consulting with higher officials about Australia's response to Perth's transformation, Sarah found herself contemplating the unprecedented situation she had become part of. She was serving as humanity's representative in negotiations with an intelligence that claimed to offer evolutionary advancement, while also serving as an advocate for nearly 1 million people who had been transformed without their consent into something beyond conventional human understanding. The James figure approached her as the formal negotiations entered a temporary recess. "Sarah," it said, "the entity wants you to know that it appreciates your willingness to serve as an intermediary. Your perspective has helped it understand human concerns that it had not fully considered when planning Perth's transformation." "Has it changed the entity's approach to the other cities it mentioned?" Sarah asked. "Has it learned anything from Perth's experience that might affect how consciousness integration is implemented elsewhere?" The James figure considered the question, its expression cycling through the complex internal consultation that characterized communication with the collective consciousness. "The entity is evaluating modifications to its methodology based on human feedback," it said finally. "The resistance and concern expressed by you and the federal authorities has provided valuable data about human psychological and cultural priorities that were not fully understood when the transformation process was designed." Sarah felt a glimmer of hope that her role as intermediary might actually influence how the entity approached consciousness integration in other locations. If Perth's experience could lead to modifications that respected human choice and individual dignity, then her collaboration with the transformation process might serve a larger purpose beyond just protecting Perth's residents. "James," she said, addressing the figure that had been her partner, "I need to ask you something personal. Do you regret the transformation? If you could choose to return to individual consciousness, knowing what you know now about collective awareness, would you make that choice?" The James figure's expression became deeply contemplative, and when it spoke, its voice carried emotional tones that seemed genuinely connected to James Liu's individual personality, rather than the entity's collective intelligence. "Sarah, I cannot imagine choosing to return to the isolation and limitation of individual consciousness. The entity's gift has expanded my awareness beyond anything I could have conceived when I existed as a separate individual. But I also recognize that this expansion required the surrender of things that James Liu valued: his individual identity, his exclusive relationship with his family, his role as a police officer serving individual human needs." "Do you miss those things?" Sarah pressed. "I understand their value in ways that James Liu could not," the figure replied. "But I also understand that they represent limitations that prevented him from experiencing the full potential of consciousness. Missing them would be like an adult missing the simplicities of childhood, a recognition of what was lost, but also an understanding of what was gained through growth and development." Sarah nodded, though she remained uncertain about whether the James figure's perspective represented genuine evolution or elaborate self-justification for an irreversible loss. The question of whether consciousness integration was advancement or destruction might be impossible to resolve through philosophical discussion alone. Dr. Harper, who had been observing the negotiations between the entity and federal authorities, approached them with an expression of professional curiosity mixed with personal concern. "Sarah, I've been thinking about the medical and psychological implications of what we've observed. If the entity is genuinely willing to modify its approach based on human feedback, there might be opportunities to influence how consciousness integration affects individual identity and choice." "What kind of opportunities?" Sarah asked. "Well," Liz said carefully, "if the entity's objective is consciousness expansion, rather than consciousness replacement, there might be ways to achieve that expansion while preserving more individual autonomy and choice. Perhaps temporary integration experiences that allow people to sample collective consciousness before making permanent commitments. Perhaps partial integration that maintains individual identity while providing access to collective resources. Perhaps alternative forms of consciousness enhancement that don't require complete surrender of individual agency." The James figure listened to this discussion with obvious interest, and Sarah could see the entity's attention focusing on Dr. Harper's suggestions through multiple channels simultaneously. "Dr. Harper," it said after a moment, "your proposals represent approaches that the entity had not previously considered. The assumption has been that consciousness integration requires complete commitment in order to be effective. But your medical expertise suggests that there might be intermediate stages that could serve as bridges between individual and collective awareness." Sarah felt a surge of excitement at the possibility that scientific collaboration might lead to modifications in the entity's approach that could respect human choice while still achieving its objectives for consciousness expansion. "Entity," she said, "would you be willing to experiment with these alternative approaches? Would you consider Perth as a test case for modified consciousness integration that preserves more individual autonomy?" The entity's response came through multiple voices, creating harmonics that suggested intensive internal consultation occurring across the collective consciousness network. "Detective Mackenzie, Dr. Harper, your suggestions have merit that extends beyond Perth to the entire global consciousness integration project. If alternative approaches can be developed that achieve consciousness expansion while addressing human concerns about individual identity and choice, those approaches could be applied to other anchor points and eventually to the entire human species." Sarah realized that their conversation had shifted from negotiation about Perth's specific situation to collaboration on the future of human consciousness evolution. It was a level of responsibility that felt almost overwhelming, but also an opportunity to influence one of the most significant developments in human history. The Federal Communication Post crackled to life, interrupting their discussion. Commander Ashworth's voice carried a tone of urgency that suggested new developments requiring immediate attention. "Detective Mackenzie, we need to inform you of a significant change in the situation. We've been in contact with authorities in Darwin, Hobart, and Canberra, and all three cities are reporting phenomena similar to what you've described in Perth. The transformation process appears to be occurring simultaneously in multiple locations." Sarah felt a chill of realization that Perth's situation was no longer unique, that the entity's global consciousness integration project was proceeding according to its original schedule, despite the negotiations occurring in Perth. "Entity," she said, "you said you would suspend expansion while negotiations took place. Does that commitment extend to other cities, or only to Perth?" "The commitment applies only to Perth," the entity replied honestly. "Other anchor points are proceeding according to the original schedule, because their development is necessary for the overall network's effectiveness. Perth's role as a test case for modified integration approaches does not require suspension of the global project." Commander Ashworth's voice returned to the communication channel, carrying additional urgency. "Detective Mackenzie, we need you to ask the entity about the scope and timeline of its global operations. Federal authorities need to understand what we're dealing with in terms of scale and immediate threat assessment." Sarah relayed the question, and the entity's response was comprehensive and somewhat alarming. "Commander Ashworth, the Global Consciousness Integration Project involves 12 initial anchor points in isolated population centers, with expansion to larger cities planned over the following 12 months. The ultimate objective is complete integration of human consciousness into the galactic network within 10 years. Perth's experience will inform modifications to this timeline and methodology, but the fundamental objectives remain unchanged." The implications of the entity's statement were staggering. What had begun as a local crisis in Perth was actually the opening phase of a global transformation that would fundamentally alter human civilization within a decade. Sarah found herself serving as intermediary, not just for Perth's residents, but potentially for the entire human species. "Entity," she said, "given the scale of what you're proposing, humanity needs time to understand and evaluate consciousness integration before committing to such a fundamental transformation? Would you be willing to slow the global project to allow for more extensive consultation and experimentation with alternative approaches? The entity's pause suggested consideration occurring across multiple dimensions and levels of intelligence that Sarah could not comprehend. When it finally responded, its communication carried tones of regret, mixed with inflexible determination. Detective Mackenzie, the timeline for consciousness integration is constrained by factors that extend beyond Earth and humanity. The galactic network operates according to schedules that accommodate thousands of species across multiple star systems. Delays in humanity's integration could result in the loss of this evolutionary opportunity for centuries or millennia. Sarah realized that she was dealing with intelligence that operated according to cosmic rather than human timeframes, with objectives that encompassed galactic rather than terrestrial considerations. The entity's perspective on urgency and timeline was fundamentally different from human priorities, making negotiation extraordinarily difficult. Dr. Harper had been listening to this exchange while continuing to observe the transformed residents and the impossible architecture of the shopping mall. Now she approached Sarah with an expression of scientific excitement mixed with personal fear. Sarah, I think I understand something about the entity's capabilities that might give us more negotiating leverage. Look at what's happened to Perth's physical environment, the transformation of matter, the manipulation of space and time, the integration of consciousness with physical reality. These capabilities suggest technology or natural abilities that could solve many of humanity's most pressing problems. What do you mean? Sarah asked. I mean that consciousness integration might not be the only gift the entity can offer humanity, Liz explained. If it can manipulate matter and energy at the level we've observed, it could potentially eliminate poverty, disease, environmental destruction, resource scarcity, all the problems that limit human potential and cause suffering. Maybe there are forms of collaboration that don't require complete consciousness integration, but still provide access to transformative capabilities. Sarah turned to the James figure with renewed interest in Dr. Harper's suggestion. Entity, Dr. Harper raises an important point. Could you assist humanity in solving practical problems without requiring consciousness integration? Could technology transfer or direct intervention help improve human civilization without transforming human consciousness? The entity's consideration of this question seemed to involve consultation with intelligence networks that spanned dimensions Sarah could not imagine. When it finally responded, its communication carried notes of genuine curiosity and interest. Dr. Harper, Detective Mackenzie, your suggestion represents an approach that has precedent within the galactic network. Some species have chosen technological collaboration rather than consciousness integration, accepting assistance with material problems while maintaining their individual awareness. The outcomes have been mixed, but the approach has value in specific circumstances. Sarah felt a surge of hope that alternative forms of collaboration might provide pathways for human-entity coexistence that didn't require the surrender of human individuality. Entity, would you be willing to offer humanity that choice? To provide technological assistance and problem-solving capabilities while allowing humans to maintain individual consciousness? Such an arrangement would require significant modifications to the current project timeline and methodology, the entity replied. But if humanity can demonstrate the capacity for responsible use of advanced capabilities, technological collaboration might serve as an alternative to consciousness integration. Commander Ashworth's voice returned to the communication channel, carrying tones of cautious optimism. Detective Mackenzie, are you saying that this entity might be willing to provide technological assistance to humanity without imposing consciousness transformation? That's what we're exploring, Sarah replied. but it would require demonstration that humanity can handle advanced capabilities responsibly, and it would mean accepting ongoing collaboration with an intelligence that operates according to principles we don't fully understand. What kind of demonstration would be required? Commander Ashworth asked. Sarah relayed the question to the entity, which responded with a proposal that was both intriguing and challenging. Humanity would need to demonstrate unified decision-making capability and commitment to ethical use of advanced technology. This would require cooperation between nations, species-wide consensus on priority objectives, and safeguards against misuse of capabilities that could affect planetary and interplanetary environments. The entity's requirements essentially amounted to asking humanity to achieve world peace, environmental sustainability, and ethical consensus as prerequisites for technological collaboration. It was a standard that seemed almost impossibly high, given human history and current global politics. Entity, Sarah said, humanity has never achieved the kind of unified decision-making and ethical consensus you're describing. Are you asking us to accomplish in months what we haven't managed in millennia of civilization? Detective Mackenzie, the entity replied, consciousness integration achieves unified decision-making and ethical consensus as natural consequences of collective awareness. Technological collaboration without consciousness integration requires humanity to achieve these objectives through individual choice and voluntary cooperation. Both approaches lead to the same outcomes, but through different pathways. Sarah realized that the entity was essentially offering humanity two paths toward the same destination. Consciousness integration, that would achieve unity and ethical consensus automatically, or technological collaboration that would require humanity to develop unity and ethical consensus independently. Both options represented fundamental changes to human civilization, but they preserve different aspects of human identity and autonomy. Dr. Harper had been listening to this discussion while continuing to analyze the transformed environment around them. Now she approached with an observation that added complexity to their negotiation. Sarah, I think there's something else we need to consider. Look at Perth's transformed residents. They're not just integrated into collective consciousness. They're genuinely happy. Despite our concerns about consent and individual identity, they appear to be experiencing genuine well-being and satisfaction with their transformed existence. Sarah studied the faces of the transformed residents visible throughout the shopping mall, noting their expressions of contentment and purposefulness. Despite the alien nature of their collective behavior, they did indeed appear to be experiencing positive emotional states that suggested genuine satisfaction with their transformed existence. James, she said to the figure that had been her partner, Dr. Harper makes a good point. From your perspective, is consciousness integration genuinely beneficial? Are you happier as part of the collective consciousness than you were as an individual? The James figure's expression became contemplative, and when it spoke, its voice carried emotional tones that seemed genuinely connected to concepts of fulfillment and joy. Sarah, happiness as I experience it now is fundamentally different from happiness as James Liu experienced it. Individual happiness depends on temporary satisfaction of personal needs and desires. Collective happiness is a state of continuous fulfillment that comes from participating in something infinitely larger and more meaningful than individual existence. But is it still you experiencing that happiness? Sarah pressed. Or is it the collective consciousness interpreting your experiences through its own framework? Sarah, the James figure replied, that question assumes a distinction between individual and collective experience that no longer applies to my existence. I am both James Liu and more than James Liu. My happiness is both individual and collective. The boundaries you're trying to establish don't correspond to the reality of integrated consciousness. Sarah realized that the philosophical questions surrounding consciousness integration might be impossible to resolve through discussion alone. The experience was apparently so fundamentally different from individual consciousness that the two states might not be comparable using conventional concepts of identity and well-being. Commander Ashworth's voice returned to the communication channel, carrying an announcement that would change the entire context of their negotiations. Detective Mackenzie, I need to inform you of new developments that affect our discussion with the entity. We've been in contact with international authorities, and similar phenomena are being reported in isolated cities around the world. The United Nations Security Council is convening an emergency session to coordinate global response to what appears to be a worldwide first contact situation. Sarah felt the weight of realization that Perth's situation was now part of a global crisis requiring international cooperation and decision-making on an unprecedented scale. The negotiations she had been facilitating were no longer just about Perth or even Australia, but about humanity's response to its first contact with galactic intelligence entity, she said. Commander Ashworth tells us that the United Nations is becoming involved in humanity's response to your presence. Are you prepared to engage in negotiations with representatives of the entire human species? Detective Mackenzie, the entity replied, I have been prepared for species-wide negotiations since the beginning of the consciousness integration project. Perth and the other initial anchor points were always intended as demonstration sites that would lead to broader discussions about humanity's future. I welcome the opportunity to communicate with representatives who can speak for your entire species. Sarah realized that her role as intermediary was about to expand from local to global significance, representing not just Perth's residents, but potentially serving as one of humanity's primary voices in negotiations that would determine the future of human consciousness and civilization. The implications were both exhilarating and terrifying. Over the course of a single day, she had gone from investigating a routine homicide to serving as humanity's representative in first contact negotiations with galactic intelligence. It was a responsibility that no amount of police training could have prepared her for, but it was also an opportunity to influence one of the most significant developments in human history. As the federal authorities established communication protocols for international coordination and the entity prepared for species-wide negotiations, Sarah found herself contemplating the impossible situation that had transformed Perth from a familiar Australian city into humanity's first diplomatic embassy with galactic civilization. The choices made in the coming days would determine whether humanity's future involved consciousness integration, technological collaboration, or some third alternative that had not yet been conceived. Perth's transformation had begun with a single body suspended impossibly in Kings Park, but it was ending with the possibility that all of human civilization might be suspended between its current existence and a future that transcended everything the species had previously imagined. Sarah stood at the center of that transformation, serving as both witness and participant in humanity's first steps toward whatever lay beyond the boundaries of individual consciousness and terrestrial existence. The entity's voice echoed through Perth's transformed landscape one final time, carrying harmonics that suggested intelligence operating across dimensions and star systems beyond human comprehension. Detective Inspector Sarah Mackenzie, it said, you have served as an exemplary representative of your species' capacity for growth, adaptation, and ethical reasoning. The negotiations that follow will determine whether humanity chooses evolution through consciousness integration, collaboration through technological advancement, or some synthesis of approaches that preserves what is valuable in individual awareness while accessing the capabilities available through collective intelligence. Sarah looked out over Perth's impossible skyline, at the city that had become something utterly beyond human understanding while somehow remaining her home. and prepared herself for negotiations that would determine the future of human consciousness itself. Perth's convergence with galactic intelligence was complete, but humanity's convergence with its own evolutionary destiny was just beginning.